Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. Today we're diving deep into the neuroscience of psychedelics with one of the field's most influential researchers. From founding the world's first Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London to his current role as the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professor at UCSF, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris has been at the forefront of psychedelic science for over 2 decades. His research on the default mode network has revolutionized our understanding of how psychedelics affect the brain, and his work continues to bridge the gap between neuroscientific and therapeutic applications. Dr. Carhart-Harris has published in prestigious journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, and Science. Time magazine named him in their 100 Next list in 2021, recognizing his potential to shape the future of psychedelic medicine. So Robin and I first met each other at Breaking Convention in 2017, and we've been Twitter buddies for a long time, and we finally ended up in the same location physically at Eudaimonia, a wellness summit that happened in West Palm Beach in November, and I got a chance to sit down and interview him in front of a live audience, and it was a fantastic interview. You're going to love this conversation. We discussed the evolution of psychedelic research and neuroscience, how the default mode network shapes consciousness, the key differences between psychedelics and traditional SSRIs, Robin's current research at UCSF, the unique properties of 5-MeO-DMT, and his personal reflections on spending now 20 years in psychedelic research. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into my conversation with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris.
I just want to first welcome you to the show, Robin.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, good to be here.
So as a little context for our audience, as well as for those who are listening at home, Robin is a British psychopharmacologist who is the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professor in the Department of Neurology at UCSF. Previously, he founded and was head of the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London and is noted for brain imaging studies of psychedelic and psychoactive drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and DMT. And in 2020, Time included him in the 100 Next list of 100 notable people poised to make history, which is fun.
That was a nice one.
Yeah. How was that to have, I mean, you've been at this since 2003 professionally, so it's basically 17 to 18 years of really hard work. How was it to receive that sort of recognition and appreciation from such a prominent publication?
Honestly, it was surprising. I thought, really? And then, you go through, my peers in the field are going to maybe question that and be like, bit of professional jealousy maybe. So, yeah, it was a sweet thing, but it was a little surprising, but really nice. Really nice to get that recognition.
Yeah, I remember I was visiting my parents back in Michigan, and they just happened to get the Time magazine. And I think at this point you were also helping to advise one of the companies that I had started, Synthesis, many years ago. And I remember opening it up and just randomly seeing your picture, and it was a real close-up. You have these, stark blue eyes that were sort of staring out from the page. And I thought, oh, that's phenomenal, because you've been at this so long. And I think the big shift now that we're seeing in this third wave of psychedelics is in the 50s and 60s. You had folks like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert,
Ralph
Metzner, who we'll talk about in a little bit, who were really prominent. And now it's much more scientists, academics, researchers, or mainstream authors like Michael Pollan that are sort of leading the charge. Why is it that has shifted from the 60s? Why is it that it's so important that we really put the science and the research at the forefront this time around, rather than, just everyone do LSD in the streets, so to say?
Well, Leary and Metzner and Ramdas, Richard Alpert started off as academics at Harvard in the psychology department. So in a sense, it started off quite buttoned up. And in the 50s especially, it was, in a sense, kind of mainstream. Psychedelics didn't have the stigma that they developed through the 60s. So they were a pretty big part of psychiatry, especially in the 50s and then into the early 60s. But something happened, and I guess there are lessons there. And some of it we're feeling today. I think the classic sort of phrase is that psychedelics left the clinic, left the lab, and entered the sort of popular culture and spilled over into art and music. And so people got very excited, you know, and psychedelics have that impact on people that, you know, people are wowed by the realization that it's even possible to have those experiences. And it's quite easy, I think, for people to get somewhat evangelical about it. And that's the story that's told about Timothy Leary, is that, yes, he was a Harvard professor in psychology and wore his suits and so on. And but he had especially, well, he turned on with psilocybin in the early 60s, I believe, and then became, you know, the proselytizer that he became, saying, you know, turn on, tune in and drop out, and the rest, which was in a sense even more incendiary. He was saying things like, your kids aren't going to fight your wars, you know, right, and drop out of, you know, your education track and so on. So he was very loose, and he changed his whole attire. And, you know, while some of that group retained that academic closeness, say Ralph Metzner, I think you could say, did that, and was a clinical psychologist and remained a very well-respected psychotherapist. And then Ram Dass with his move into spirituality. But I think these days, yeah, it's broad. I mean, Michael Pollan's book was the really big inflection point, I think, in 2018, How to Change Your Mind, you know, another bestseller from him, and his profile coming in, being such a big author already.
And what did that book do for your career? I mean, it's 2018, that book comes out, it's a #1 New York Times bestselling book. You're, if not, you're one of the most prominent people who is featured in that book. What's the before and after for your professional life as a result of that getting published?
Well, I think it did me a lot of favors. He looked at a short list of human neuroscientists working with psychedelics, and I was on it. And he visited my flat in Lepret Grove in London, very scruffy flat. Remember kind of, you know, apologizing because I didn't have any biscuits to give him. And so it was very English setup in Notting Hill with a pot of tea and a lack of biscuits and all this. Oh, sorry. But we sat there. And
how was the weather on that day?
Oh, it was probably cloudy, of course. Yeah, probably rainy. But he was charming, and I'd met him once briefly before.
At the MAPS conference the year
This was
before,
actually
or?
Compass Pathways. Early days, they were touring the Isle of Man with the possibility of opening up some end-of-life care with psilocybin therapy, and, you know, utilizing the relative freedom they have in the Isle of Man to set their own policy on drugs. And Michael was there, in a sense, observing with a view to the book. And so we met and chatted then. Yeah, it was very charming. And he just, you know, did what Michael does. He sort of, I think he relaxes his assumptions, and like a good journalist, and listens. And so, yeah, we had a good chat. And then I was pleased to see that a lot of it had gone in, and I think he was quite impressed. You know, it matters to me that I be able to explain my perspective on how this is working in the brain in a way that other people are going to understand, journalists and then the readers. So I was trying my best, in a sense, to explain it as best as I understood it without being too jargonistic and complicated.
Well, that's something we were talking about before we went live, which is you've done such a phenomenal job as a neuroscientist creating this bridge between the sort of academic ivory tower and, you know, the mainstream populace. There's a reason I think you were named one of Time's 100 most, influential or people poised to make history, because you have a way of creating context or models that are based on metaphor that can be easily understood. And the most prominent one that I think came out of Michael Pollan's book was this notion of the default mode network. And I'd love to start there and just kind of talk a little bit about what were some of those initial assumptions behind how psychedelics could interrupt this default mode network? And over the last 10 years, how has your understanding of the default mode network or general brain networks continued to grow and evolve?
Yeah, well, the default mode network is a system. It's a network in the brain that is special for a few reasons. It's disproportionately large in our species. It is the most high-level network hierarchically, so it's involved in the most abstract aspects of thinking, things like imagination, the ability to imagine the future and also recollect the past, to imagine other people's state of mind, so-called theory of mind. And it's very metabolically active. It's very hungry. It eats up a lot of the body's energy and gets a lot of the brain's blood flow. The brain already being a remarkably hungry organ,
Right.
Eating up, disproportionate amounts of
Like 30% of our energy,
30% plus, I think. And for mass and weight, that's wildly disproportionate. It's a very, very hungry organ, and especially in our species. And then the default mode network is front and center of that, demand in a sense. But there's a curious thing about the default mode, and there's a clue in the name, default mode. It's a system that is especially active when we're, in inverted commas, idling or daydreaming. But there's a paradox there because we're never really idling, When we're mindless, we're actually very mentally active. And that daydreaming is very, very active, as we know from mindfulness and the idea of quietening that chatter in a sense. But that sort of itinerant movement in the mind is seated in a sense in the default mode network. It's a very flexible network. It's also a hub of connectivity. So disproportionately, regions in the brain will project into the default mode network, and the default mode network will disproportionately project out to a lot of brain regions. So it's a sort of, like a hub airport in a sense, or capital city where it all happens. So it's special for those reasons. And in 2012, at least, this was the first time that it was published on. We published on our first fMRI work with psilocybin, which was actually the first fMRI work with psilocybin, psilocybin being magic mushrooms. And a major finding there was the changes in activity, both drops in blood flow, but also changes in synchronous activity, coherence or coupling. We call it functional connectivity. Those changes implicated the default mode network. It said that something big's going on in the brain, but especially so in the default mode network. And later on, through doing work with LSD, more fMRI work, and using some other brain imaging modalities, and then also doing DMT work, and other teams in the field doing their own brain imaging work, there was some degree of reliability with this default mode network effect. And the story's more complex, and there's much more to it than just a default mode network centric action. But it hasn't gone away. In a sense, it's not wrong. There's just more to it, which is often how it goes in science.
And just briefly then, so when we take a psychedelic and it interrupts this default mode, how is that then beneficial or helpful for our psyche, for our sense of being, for, depression, addiction, PTSD, some of these indications that psychedelics are showing to be potentially helpful with?
Sure. So first of all, the disruption is a disruption, and it's actually paradoxically an excitation, but it's an excitation that dysregulates. So a lot of what the brain does, and especially the default mode network, is compress in this top-down way. It chunks information and compresses, in a sense, the granularity out of information. It coarse grains, and just like metaphor does, and so that's how the default mode network default mode network works ordinarily, but under psychedelics, it's kind of scrambled up. It's excited in a way that makes the patterns of activity more fine-grained rather than coarse-grained. And that's true of the default mode network. So it's like it's disintegrated, functionally disintegrated under the drug. I call that action an entropic action. This breakdown, like entropy is disorder, and like the second law of thermodynamics is things tend towards disorder over time, like how a living system will eventually die and degrade. It's a similar kind of principle. Under the drug, organization breaks down, generally speaking. And that's very true of the default mode network.
And this is, I think it's both a double-edged sword in many ways. You know, we train a number of coaches, practitioners, guides, facilitators who are working with psychedelics. And I always say the destabilization is both an opportunity and a risk. In that if there's a great set and setting that's part of the experience or after the experience, there can be sort of a re-annealing of the brain. The neuroplasticity provides an opportunity for substantial change. But if there's not that proper support, which we see sometimes with experiences, then that destabilization can lead to, you know, quitting jobs, which may not be the best decision, or leaving relationships, which may not be the best decision, or, you know, making impulsive decisions in the wake of these experiences that may not be best for the long-term interests.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to bring up in a sense, that spotlighting a limitation and a weakness. But just as you say, you know, in a sense, every change has a cost and a benefit. But the benefit is that we're breaking down an excessive control, in a sense. And much of mental illness involves habits that are too strong, that have developed often as defensive reactions to adversity or trauma. And they are designed, in a sense, evolutionarily to protect us. Just like the ego has evolved to have this controlling executive function. And there's a benefit to that, clearly, because it wouldn't have evolved otherwise. And the benefit, in a sense, is that exceptional control that humans have and assume over themselves and other people and the environment and the rest of nature. That has given us some evolutionary advantage. However, we know it's come at a cost. And perhaps mental illness is part of that. It's part of, in a sense, how ego or something of ego can go awry when ego is defending because it's been hurt. So, you know, so much of mental illness, whether it's ruminating on a negative perception of oneself in depression, that's a kind of habit that develops implicitly often. It's sort of gradual. It's like a learning, but an unconscious learning. Sure, maladaptive, but also weirdly adaptive in another sense. It's protective. And then, you know, there are so many examples. Obsessive compulsive disorder, it's that control. Sure, there could be intrusive thoughts coming up, but then a control on top of it that's behavioral and cognitive. Addictions, you know, there are obvious habits there. And like Gabor Mate would say, you know, it's not why the addiction, but why the pain. So the addiction's serving a function. It's maybe an escape. Maybe it's giving people a level, at least while they're under the influence of, say, a drug, some sense of ability to think and function where ordinarily they are dysregulated, and that's hard to tolerate. I mean, I could go on and on with these examples of sort of protective ways that people become when injured in some way, and these defense mechanisms which could be characterized as an excess of order, a sort of dysfunctional order. And so there, the benefit of a disorganizing action from a psychedelic starts to make sense. We need some destabilization there because a pathological stabilization has happened with the pathology. So it's sure you're introducing a kind of chaos, and that can be wildly unpleasant and nightmarish. Sometimes it can be blissful, but it's intense as hell. And you know, it's like a quality of how psychotherapy works. That's the best way to understand the action of psychedelic therapy, is really to look at some of the core factors of how psychotherapy works. And one of them is destabilization, at least the depth psychotherapies, you know. But even now, these third wave psychotherapies like acceptance, commitment therapy, internal family systems, they do involve like going there, going to difficult places, but going there with an intention to work on a greater acceptance and understanding. It's very consistent, very resonant with the intention behind, you know, well-delivered psychedelic therapy.
Well, and there's like a willful choice in that. And I even get that phrase from cold plunging, where it's the difference between someone throwing you in a cold lake without really wanting to be thrown in a cold lake and making that commitment and decision that I know this is going to be uncomfortable. I know this may be difficult. I know this may not be pleasant necessarily, but I'm going to make the choice to get in the cold plunge because I know the benefits that come after it will be substantial. Or even CrossFit is another good example. I did CrossFit for a couple of years, very intense workouts. You know, you're going to get your ass kicked, right? But you come out the other side and you feel incredible as a result of that. So I think psychedelics offer them this, you know, Dave Rabin calls it they're neurocatalytic, and that they offer a window of plasticity or possibility that allows for these protective mechanisms to take a back seat. And to be repatterned in some ways.
Yes, absolutely. They're catalytic, and again, the clues in the name psychedelic, they're psyche revealing.
Right.
So, but the intention is key. You're absolutely right. If you were to drop some LSD in someone's drink, they're not going to have a good time. It's probably not going to be therapeutic. So there's something of courage involved in the intention of doing psychedelic therapy. And there's something of empowerment. So you set that intention, I'm going to do something that could be difficult, but you're recognizing the potential benefits through going through that challenge. It's classic hero's journey stuff, you know? And for those who are aware of that or not, you know, that idea was beautifully articulated by Joseph Campbell, a anthropologist, psychologist, borrowing from ideas from Carl Jung, and it's this idea that it's a universal and, in a sense, timeless human story that we go through ordeals, and when this happens. Sometimes we sign up to it, you know, it's like we're going on an adventure. We're going to put ourselves in a vulnerable place intentionally because we're on a mission, you know, of development. And there's going to be struggle and ordeal when you're in the belly of the whale, you know. So there's a bunch of stories from different cultures and people at different times that appeal to this meta narrative. He calls it a monomyth, that resonate with it. But the key thing is that as you're coming through the ordeal, you come through the ordeal, and there's a sense of triumph and accomplishment, and there's something in that that's, I think, at the heart of how psychedelic therapy can be beneficial.
So I want to kind of shift into talking a little bit about the history of psychedelics and neuroscience in particular, because I think it's a pretty fascinating thread, and it explains a lot about why we are here in the moment that we are. Meaning psychedelics are undergoing this massive resurgence of interest. $3.5 billion has been invested into the psychedelic space in the last 5 years. We're seeing now hundreds of research papers that are coming out. Oregon, Colorado, potentially Massachusetts with the election on Tuesday, legalizing psychedelics. So we're really in the thick of this renaissance, or this third wave of psychedelics. And in many ways, we've somewhat been here before, right? In the 50s, 1,000 clinical papers published on the efficacy of LSD. It's legal and widespread until California made it illegal in 66, and then the federal government in 68, and then the UN in 71, right? We've been in drug prohibition ever since. Now, what's interesting is serotonin was discovered in 1948, and we were talking a little bit before the show. Can you just talk a little bit about what is this relationship between the invention of LSD and our better understanding of how serotonin works in the brain?
Well, I guess there was a lot of discovery in the middle of the 20th century around brain chemistry or psychopharmacology. What it gave rise to was the dominance of drug treatments in psychiatry. But for a period before it went the way of chronic medication, psychedelics were on the scene. And actually, in the early 50s, when the first research started to take off in the West, with in the US specifically with psychedelics, it was realized that psychedelics interact with this serotonin system. So serotonin discovered first, but very close in time to the discovery of psychedelics action. Well, in a sense, going back 38 is around the time that both were discovered.
Right.
And I think serotonin in the brain in 48. So you could put the discovery of the psychoactivity of LSD before serotonin, and mescaline was researched and discovered, its molecular structure discovered even earlier. So there is this interesting sort of dance between psychedelic science and very fundamental brain science. But it was in the 50s that people realized that psychedelics and LSD in particular interacts with the serotonin system. And because of that discovery, they put two and two together and thought, well, maybe serotonin is important in psychiatry for controlling conscious states, states like psychosis, mood states. So it's very valid to say that psychedelic research catalyzed psychopharmacology research and an awareness of the involvement of serotonin in conscious states and states relevant to mental health. So there's an interesting dance there, and even the blocking of aspects of the serotonin system and how that might be used in the treatment of schizophrenia involved research with LSD as well.
And it's interesting that even though this is the case, that LSD played a very influential role in helping to understand serotonin and, brain science and eventually neuroscience as well, that the path that was taken was not actually LSD, as we know, not actually psychedelics. Those actually got shut down. And instead, it was Prozac and Lexapro and Zoloft, these SSRIs that work fundamentally different in the brain compared to psychedelics. And there was a great conversation here at the summit yesterday with Mark Hyman and Callie Means and a couple others about the biology of something or other. And Mark said something really interesting, which was that psychiatric drugs are the second most prescribed drugs now that are available to us. And one could argue overprescribed in many cases. And so I'm curious to hear your sort of lens or perspective of how is it that psychedelics interact different in the brain compared to SSRIs, and why are more and more people looking to psychedelics, looking to wean off SSRIs? What can psychedelics do that maybe SSRIs aren't so great at helping with?
Yeah. Well, I listened to that panel and it was absolutely fascinating. What was being highlighted was how profitable, in a sense, the chronic medication strategy is generally in medicine, in healthcare. and it's gone awry. There's too much of it. It doesn't benefit people. There's a lot of marketing around the benefits of chronic medication, and but it's there's financial incentives underneath it, and so it's somewhat conspiratorial, but also it was landing. It seems to be landing with the audience, and it was resonating with me. And it's true in psychiatry that chronic dosing took over. It sort of took over for pragmatic reasons. Partly it was that people could be discharged from mental institutes and be under the influence of sometimes sedating medication, but be at home. And so there was a financial incentive in that respect. But it certainly dominates things, and it's a certain model of treating mental illness that is distinct from psychedelics. Psychedelic therapy is less about drugs, ironically. There's fewer drug sessions, in some of the trials there's been just one, and yet very rapid and often enduring therapeutic benefit. We don't know how many treatments is optimal, but it's few. It's maybe 2-3 within a 12-month window or 6-month window. So there's less dependence on drug, and it more of a role for psychotherapy. The drug action marries better with the core action of psychotherapy, as I was saying. The destabilization, but also the importance of therapeutic alliance, the relationship, trust, self-discovery, adherence rates, sticking to the treatment. It's a major aspect of how psychotherapy works, is that people sign up and commit to it. But most people do with psychedelic therapy, perhaps because there are a few dosing sessions. Right. They show up, and so the adherence rates are really high, disproportionately high for other treatments. Drug treatments, many people don't take their drugs every morning because they don't like the side effects and so on. So it is radically different in that sense, but that's also one of the real world challenges of this model, that what are the companies selling? Right. Because there's less of an emphasis on the drug product. Right. And it's created a lot of tension and debate in this space around the viability of the economic model with psychedelic therapy.
Well, and especially as of late, because we're recording this just a few months after MAPS had attempted to get MDMA approval for PTSD, and they attempted to do it with psychotherapy through the Food and Drug Administration, who does not, oversee psychotherapy, and they were rejected, I think, partly on the grounds that this is not only the drug, but it's also the psychotherapy that is being used as part of the drug treatment. So now you have companies like MindMed, who are doing LSD for general anxiety, but they don't have therapists. They have sitters who are simply present, but not necessarily actively involved. So it's interesting to see how some of these biotech companies are starting to shape their idea of how they can get psychedelics approved based on the FDA, which I would argue is an outdated paradigm that's rooted in this biological model of treatment that was emphasized in the early 80s with SSRIs, and that we're now discovering is maybe fundamental to why we have mental health epidemic in the first place.
Yeah. So there's a very deep and influential square hole in a sense, and we have with psychedelic therapy a different shaped peg. Let's say it's round, being sort of, do we try and force it into this hole, or perhaps rethink the whole paradigm? It is that hole, that square hole is dominated by biocentrism, by the hard sciences, and a perspective on health that is biology first, and isn't holistic, isn't integrative. And many of the disorders, especially in mental illness, aren't entirely biological. they're biological, but they're also psychological, sociological, and in a sense spiritual. And so perhaps we should meet the problems that are of that nature with treatments that are of that nature, that don't just hit on the biology, but also acknowledge the psychology and the other factors. And that's the psychedelic therapy model. When done best, it's biopsychosocial, or for some people, biopsychosocial spiritual. It's holistic, it's integrative, and that's its great appeal. That's why there's a buzz around this treatment, that it's more human, it's more holistic, it's more honest in a sense, resonates with people. And there's that kind of recommendation loop that happens because people benefit and they talk about it. So that's where we are. It's an exciting time in that sense. If the model is allowed to be what it is, that integrative, holistic model, if it's allowed to be that and then press on the system, that's where I feel most optimistic. What I worry about is when people are sort of too, in a sense, respectful of the current paradigm, and maybe they think that they're being good scientists by being very biocentric. I mean, I'm a neuroscientist and I want to understand how this works in the brain, and I recognize that it's a fundamental aspect of things. But you can spend far too long looking at one side of the coin and forget about the other. But fundamentally, there's another side to the coin, the subjective psychological aspect of things. So that's one of the challenges that we have right now. And I think mistakes could be made if we try and force this, special peg into a hole that it doesn't fit well. Going back to the 50s and the 60s and how drug treatments took off generally in psychiatry, one of the reasons that they did is that they fitted nicely a fresh paradigm for testing drugs,
right.
The double-blind randomized control trial. You could give these drugs that had somewhat subtle effects, at least not psychedelic-like effects, and then, give half of the sample placebos, and people couldn't always work out what they were given. So the experimental paradigm, the science was quite tight. And so people appealed to the quality of the evidence that was backing these drug treatments. But in a sense, they reified or made special the approach and the scientific approach above and beyond the actual treatment. And psychedelics fell by the wayside because they didn't fit that model.
Placebo-controlled model.
Yeah, that people.
Because if you take LSD, you typically know you've taken LSD.
It's obvious,
right?
And that problem then that contributed to psychedelics falling by the wayside. Yes, there was Timothy Leary telling everyone to turn on, tune in, drop out, and the popularization of psychedelics, and then the media sort of alarmism around serious adverse events that were real, but they were also doing something there, creating a moral panic. It's sort of, in a sense, rearing its head again, but in a different way.
Well, and there's also, I read this great book called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, who now has, I think, a blog that he publishes called Mad in America. And in Anatomy of an Epidemic, he compares or says that the psychiatric model not only was rooted in this double-blind placebo-controlled model, but also came from the model that antibiotics were used in and penicillin was used in. That if an infection comes up, that you just take a pill and it'll immediately address that infection. Whereas the brain, he argues, is actually much more complex and complicated, that you can't just sort of zero in on a particular neurotransmitter and adjust that and it's going to fix it, that it actually sets off this sort of rippling in the complex system of the brain that has a lot of unintended, let's say, side effects or consequences as a result of that.
Yeah. I think that's part of the picture, is that there were successes throughout the 20th and 19th centuries with a biocentric model in other domains of health, so germ theory and the realization of the basis of infection led to changes in practice, the importance of sanitation, which is thought to be responsible for a major uptick in longevity, clean drinking water, sanitation around childbirth and so on. So there were real successes there through discoveries in biology. And it's just the case that this is the way things go, that we often overshoot with faith in a model. And I think we've overshot with a faith and an attachment to the biological model. It's not that it's wrong. It's just in the domain of mental illness that it's more complex. Right. It's more systems level. That's the nature of the problem. Therefore, perhaps it should be the nature of the solution.
Beautifully said. So I want to talk about some of your current research. A few years ago, you had founded the Center of Psychedelic Research at Imperial College. I believe it was maybe the second after Johns Hopkins.
Oh, we were first.
You were first. Okay, that's clearly an important distinction. So you founded the first ever Psychedelic Research Center, and this was at Imperial College, where you had been for how many years at that point?
Oh, gosh. In 2019, we founded the center in April, and I'd been there since 2009. Okay, after a Ph.D. in Bristol, and then I moved to Imperial following David Nutt. It was a long-term mentor for me.
And soon after that, you moved to the Bay Area, and you've now been the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professor of Psychopharmacology?
Neurology and psychiatry, yeah.
Okay. All these very complex
long
words. And I'm curious, why the jump? Why the leap? Why is it that you moved out to California and took that role at UCSF?
There were a few factors at play. But I like to spotlight the positives, which were that I have always been made to feel welcome when coming to the States. And there's something of the spirit here, I think generally, especially in the Bay Area, that rewards success and hard work, rewards pushing on the frontiers, and isn't shy to express it as well. So I very much enjoyed the welcome that I was getting generally, and so an enthusiasm, but also within psychiatry. So I'd be invited to psychiatry meetings and be really embraced by like leading figures in academic psychiatry here. And then when I was recruited to UCSF, again, there was a lot of enthusiasm, less kind of hierarchical feel to things. The interaction with the chair of neurology at UCSF was fantastic. He was so warm and welcoming. And that made a big difference. It was like I've been going hard for a long time against the current. And really huge credit and gratitude to David Nutt for giving me that opportunity to do what I was doing. Amanda Fielding as well of the Beckley Foundation helping us along, especially early on. But it was always against the current. And there's a deep establishment feel generally, I think, in Europe and perhaps especially in the UK, that was frustrating after a while. It was like, come on, we founded the first center. Let's feel proud of it. Right. And so to be met with a different spirit in the US made a big difference.
Yeah, and I mean, the Bay Area is the home of tech and Silicon Valley and innovation that was heavily influenced by LSD and psychedelics. So I think it's natural for it to come full circle and for you to sort of feel synchronous in that way, for you to step into that role.
Yeah, the first time I visited the US, it was a MAPS conference way back, I don't know, 2010.
2010.
Yeah, it was a really early one. And it was in close to Silicon Valley. And there was a Icelandic volcano that erupted at the time that grounded a lot of flights. So I got stuck in the bay. Terrible thing to happen. And I kind of fell in love with it. So that was part of it as well. It was like my first time over to the States was a special time. I hung out in Haight-Ashbury and stayed at the Red Victorian, if anyone knows So it all had a kind of special feel. It was very sort of romantic in a sense. And that was planted, I think, in my heart, such that I knew that this was the epicenter. And with the psychedelic renaissance to come to the Bay was a special thing. Yeah.
And so what research projects are you currently focused on? What is really exciting you? What are you curious about? What are you looking to sort of push forward and further develop and reify in the sort of mainstream?
Well, I'm trying to do less, but with the less better in a sense. So I'm doing more fMRI, but I'm doing an approach which is very popular at the moment called precision fMRI, which speaks to like big data and deep sampling, which means you collect a lot of data within a single individual, smaller sample, but very deep sampling within individuals. So we have people in the scanner for 12 hours.
On LSD.
9 hours on psilocybin. So it's a heavy lift. It's a heavy lift for people, and I don't sell it, but for the brave souls who come through, we're very grateful. And so we get a ton of data, and that depth of data is allowing us to address novel questions that haven't been answered before. You know, things like what's the nature of a difficult psychedelic experience, a so-called bad trip, if you want. There are periods within experiences that are more challenging. And so what's the signature to that? What's the signature to letting go to a psychedelic experience? What's the signature to moments of insight under a psychedelic? What's the signature to the positive mood states that you can see? So we're being able to address questions that previously we haven't been able to. The other big study is big in a different sense. It's a big sample, 120 people, and it's really going at, I would say, the key question in this space right now, the question that, disrupted the MAPS effort to get FDA approval, which is how much of this is drug, how much of this is the extra stuff. Yes, psychotherapy, but also music listening and decorating the room and setting intention and doing integration work. So we have a study that has 4 groups, and 2 of the groups have psilocybin, 2 have placebo, and 2 of the groups have a enriched set and setting or context with the music listening, with the psychotherapy, with the lovely room decoration and lovely scents and so on, aromas. And then one that strips that away and does basic safety monitoring, a little bit like how MindMed explain what they do. Basic safety monitoring, but no active psychotherapy, no music.
No music.
Yeah, it's a clinical research facility, which is new and, very nice, but the fluorescent lighting is on.
Oh.
Yeah, and the bed is the usual examination bed, So it's daring, but sometimes in science you have to take some risk in order to move the field on. That's such a true principle.
Right.
That I don't think people always get, There's a very interesting tension between the motivation and approach for optimal psychedelic therapy to get the best outcomes. But then there can sometimes be a competing consideration around really high quality science to move the field and address questions that are, at the moment are hanging as unanswered and creating major problems because they're unanswered.
Clarifying variables that have an outsized impact on the actual efficacy of psychedelics is sort of what I'm hearing.
We'll be able to say how much of this is drug and how much of it is the synergy that we assume between drug and context or set and setting. So I'm really proud to be doing that study because it feels like a really pivotal one in the space. Like its impact will impact on the space for decades to come. But it's also aligned with Ralph Metzner, and he coined the term with Timothy Leary, set and setting. And so it's a beautiful full circle in a way to be doing that work and doing it, with the honor of having my position in his name.
We have about 10 minutes left or so, and I want to make sure we talk about 5-MeO, DMT. So 5-MeO, DMT, many of our listeners have heard of it before. It is both a synthetic, but also a natural toad venom from the Sonoran desert toad. Maybe you know the story, but I still don't know how they figured out that if you milk this toad and smoke this venom, that you would get it's like the Everest of psychedelics, I think is what you've referred to it as. Probably the toad talked to them at some point, like with ayahuasca, how the plants talk to them. I wouldn't be surprised, right? If you do enough psychedelics or you're enough in that space, that would certainly open those channels. But what is it about 5-MeO DMT that is so provoking for you, or so curiosity inducing about that molecule and that Everest of psychedelics?
Yeah. Well, Everest of psychedelics was Michael Pollan. His beautiful poetry and How to Change Your Mind, he called it that. Hit by a Category 5 storm. It's amazing, his section on 5-MeO. It seems somehow extra. It seems somehow more intense and different in interesting ways in terms of its subjective effects and in terms of its pharmacology. Most of the classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, their key action seems to be through the serotonin 2A receptor, which is heavily expressed in the cortex that humans have so much of. It's really what sets us apart as
the prefrontal cortex.
Well, not just the prefrontal cortex. Okay. Yeah. It's the default mode network cortex. It's that high-level associative cortex, transmodal cortex, meaning it's involved in a lot of different things. It's like a jack-of-all-trades cortex. And that's where the 2A receptors heavily expressed. And the classic psychedelics hit that. They dysregulate the systems that express the receptors, cause that entropic effect, break down those systems, and hey presto, you trip balls. So there we go. And then 5-MeO, it doesn't seem to hit the 2A receptor with the same affinity. So how the hell do you trip balls so intensely without it hitting that receptor? It hits another serotonin receptor, the 1A receptor, with very high affinity, meaning it's really sticky for it. And that other receptor is called the serotonin 1A receptor, and that's heavily expressed in more fundamental structures in the brain stem in particular, and midbrain, aspects of the brain involved in conscious states like wakefulness, and really basic autonomic functioning like breathing, appetite, and so on, sleep. And the serotonin cell bodies are concentrated in that midbrain, and they spit out serotonin with a clock-like regularity, 1 hertz, so 1 a second bursts, regularly while we're awake. It shuts off entirely during dream sleep.
Oh, interesting.
This clock-like serotonin cell bodies. The origin of all serotonin in the brain originates in this brainstem. And lo and behold, they heavily express 1A receptors. And those are the receptors that 5-MeO hits. So I do have a theory that that's what 5-MeO is doing. It's rapid acting. And I think it's a rapid shutting off of that clock-like spitting out of serotonin. I think it's that. And also when 5-MeO is metabolized, it's metabolized to something called bufotenine, which has somewhat psychedelic properties itself and has a high affinity for the 2A receptor.
And is this in Yopo, the snuff?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's also in the toad.
It is.
It's not very good for you peripherally. It has vascular effects, and it can be quite unpleasant on its own. Right. But I sense that it's a combination of shutting off the raphe, where these 1A receptors are heavily expressed in the brainstem, in the midbrain, and then a combination, maybe of bufotenine and maybe a bit of 5-MeO, dysregulating the cortex still, but like a double whammy. Shutting off a regular thing that's going to then regulate the rest of the brain, while also scrambling in the higher level aspects of the brain. I think that could be what's going on with 5-MeO, but it's a hypothesis. We're going to try and do some multimodal brain imaging of 5-MeO, trying to get some money for that at the moment.
At very high doses or at lower doses as well?
Not super high doses, because we'll be doing it in an MRI scanner, and proportion of people on 5-MeO move around.
Right.
You get the Buddhas who can lie still, and that's who we'll want to recruit.
Good luck.
Yeah, but even those, I mean, how still do they stay really? So it's a challenging one. We're going to keep the dose relatively low to try and, achieve the mission.
And there's more. I mean, 5-MeO has been talked about probably for the last 10 years prominently, and up until about a year or two ago, it was mostly talked about in a context of very high doses, going for unity, white light, bliss consciousness, right, non-duality. And more I'm hearing it talked about in very low doses, sort of ultra low doses, even, which can be accomplished with vape pens, and in conjunction with IFS, parts work, somatic work, body work, right? That those very low doses offer a chance to sort of bring the nervous system up into a more activated state without totally overwhelming the sort of protective systems that have kept people sort of alive and along. Because I've heard a lot of not so great stories about people who are thrown into 5-MeO at too high of a dose, and they can't recover for a month or 3 months or 6 months after the experience because it's so jarring for their sense of reality.
I think the action of psychedelic therapy generally is one of reset and recalibration. That sounds very mechanistic, and it is. Of course, there's much more to it than that. But that's a big part of it. And I think that is also the action of 5-MeO when it's used therapeutically. It's another very intense, potentially reset and recalibration action.
So my final question is, we've been very heady, which I love. I love the intellectual discourse and neuroscience and psychedelics and history, and it's my jam. But I'm curious from a heart perspective, you've been at this 20 years now, or 21, since 2003 professionally. You did it for a long time without any sort of expectation, I would imagine, of professional success. Maybe you had an inkling or an intuition that at some point this would become very big, but I think to be where we are now was not necessarily expected even as long as 2014 or 2015, right? So there's been this massive surge of interest. And I'm just curious, for someone who's been at this so long and has done so much work in the lab and put so much of your time, energy, and effort into this work, why are you so devoted to psychedelics? What is it that has you or had you show up in those early years and really commit to this as a profession and a curiosity when, probably everyone thought you were a little sort of batshit crazy for doing so?
Well, they did. My mum would say, like, can you not study something else?
Right.
As she could see how frustrated I was with, not getting grants, not getting recognition and so on. So, it's very pleasing and satisfying to have made it and to have a degree of professional stability, and also, of course, to see the way that the space is developing and continuing to grow at the moment. It's very exciting. It was always fun early on. Like, I couldn't do anything else, and the fun was in the excitement of discovery. It was very playful. It was quite innocent and naive in that respect. It was just like, this is freaking interesting, and I just can't let it go. Like, I got that thread and I've just followed it ever since. It is heady, and that's a thing. It's the classic thing of an academic, that you get so stuck in your head and forget about the heart stuff. But that comes in with psychedelics. It's really it's very fortuitous that it does appeal to the heart. And so you get those reminders that maybe in other domains of science you don't have such ready access to. So with spirituality and wisdom teachings and the experience itself and witnessing that it is, the action is not intellectual in a sense. It's of the heart. It's very human. It's of nature. that's very grounding, and it's very, I feel very grateful that to be studying something that gives me that, you know, those reminders.
That's beautifully said. So it's been an honor. I so appreciate you. I know we've been attempting to do an interview for what seems like years. I think we first connected in 2017 at Breaking Convention and spoke a little bit after about some microdosing trial design. And it's really fun to be able to do this here at Eudaimonia with a public audience. And I'm just so appreciative of your time and your efforts in this space. I think, you know, they've not only been hugely influential for psychedelics, but for culture at large, as we sort of go deeper into neuroscience and what it means to be human, and what the brain can teach us about even consciousness, which if we had a couple more hours, we could unpack even more. But mostly I'm just so appreciative and grateful of your work and what you've contributed to not only this space, but also humanity. So
thank you, Paul. I really appreciate that. And back at you, I appreciate the platform that you've created, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you, Robin.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to grow your own medicine from microdosing or high-dose experiences, check out our Mushroom Grow Kit. It's the simplest way to get a reliable source of high-quality mushrooms, and it includes detailed videos walking you through the entire process. No guessing, just clear instructions for best results. Check out the link in the description below.